There's an additional tool in the IFC and in the, which is International Fire Code, and the Michigan Mechanical or International Mechanical Codes, that 102.9 is the code section. And that's titled Matters Not Provided For. So again, if somebody wants to debate you calling out certain requirements for one of these units, if it's not provided for anywhere else, you not only have the right to ask for this, you actually have the duty to determine if matters haven't been provided for in the code or in the instructions or in the listing. If there's a gap somewhere, you have to fill that gap in.
I wanted to read the 102.9 requirements not covered by this code. Requirements.
Yeah, thank you.
Requirements not covered by this code. Requirements necessary for the strength, stability, or proper operation of an existing or proposed mechanical system, or for the public safety, health, and general welfare not specifically covered by this code, shall be determined by the code official.
So that's a mandate to the code official. That's not telling the code official, hey, you can deal with this if you want to. It's telling you you have to deal with it. So these are the kind of topics I like to stress, because I'll tell you, you know, in my early days, and early being 10 years, I took it as, you know, I honestly probably never used that code section. But that code section is very important. It's put there for that specific reason, the specific topic of what we're talking about today. There are several matters in this application, in this particular, you know, indoor cultivation, if you will. It doesn't involve really just marijuana. I mean, they indoor cultivate for all types of crops nowadays. So a lot of the hazards are quite similar. CO2 enrichment, chemicals used, fertilizers used, insecticides used, things of that nature. So typically up in the upper right corner now, let's go to the bottle. This shows a bottle. Now this could be a compressed gas bottle with only compressed gas as a gas. Or typically what it would be, looks like a compressed gas bottle but contains liquid. Your typical CO2 tank, the really short ones, contain 20 pounds of liquid. The ones that are like chest high, like 4 to 5 feet high, contain approximately 50 pounds of liquid. CO2 having an expansion ratio of 535 to 1. So let's say 1 cubic foot of liquid equals 535 cubic foot of CO2 gas at 100% concentration. Now, it takes only 5,000 parts per million to reach the permissible exposure limit for CO2. If you exceed that permissible exposure limit, which is really a PEL level or an OEL level, is what's allowed a person to be exposed to for an 8-hour workday. So if you exceed that, and the person happens to be working in there all day, now you have serious health consequences. So what you see here in this upper right corner in this box with the tank, what you see is basically the operating control that controls the CO2 discharge. So it's a flow meter, it's a timer, it's a solenoid, and then it's a series of dispensing nozzles. Sometimes they dispense it into the ductwork of the HVAC unit. But the liquefied gas, which is typically used in these applications, can last quite a while because of the expansion ratio. So one bottle can fill, even a 20-pound cylinder can provide enough CO2 gas to create a health issue in a 1,200 square foot space very easily. Get into some more details on CO2 later. I'm going to touch on that periodically throughout the presentation. Just a quick view of, on this slide here, we're talking about extraction and processing. It really should say extraction, processing, and related processes, because there are a lot of other processes that introduce hazards into these spaces, like packaging, grinding, drying of the fibers and the plant material. This particular slide here looks like a butane honey oil extraction, where they introduce butane through the plant material, and out the bottom, the butane acts as a solvent to strip the plant of its oils. This then falls into a pan or a tray. This was the old-fashioned homegrown way, typically, to do this in people's basements, garages, apartments, and henceforth why we had numerous deaths, fires, and explosions because of the venting butane. These bubbles are actually the gas that's trying to escape from that liquid. Even the small foam bubbles, that's what those bubbles are, is the butane gas trying to release. Here, you probably can't read all the wording on this. It's just for informational purposes. I have this slide up here. It's a LARA bulletin, advisory bulletin. LARA stands for Licensing and Regulatory Affairs. Now, this particular one is dated April 10th of 2018. Notice the key words, though, advisory bulletin. Okay, I want to tell you the scope of these things. People get hung up on, hey, this is my list of code requirements. It is anything but the list of code requirements. All this is I'm going to relabel this and call it a friendly reminder. What happens is, as many building departments, and LARA is, its own building department to speak of as well, because they also perform inspections. When we run into things periodically, repetitively, over and over again, we like to produce a document, would be called an advisory bulletin or a guideline or a friendly handout, to help people through the process. So I'm going to read the first paragraph here. It's going to tell you, it says, please note the following excerpts from the 2018 NFPA Fire Code 1 and the 2016 version of NFPA 55. This list is not all-inclusive. Keywords. So I've had numerous people get hung up on these and say, this is all I need to take care of. And like I say, far from the truth. They're telling you right in the first sentence, first paragraph, this is not all-inclusive, but highlights areas to consider when navigating the application and inspection process. So it's not only a guide for or helpful tool for designers, installers, owners, but also inspectors. Marijuana facilities utilizing liquid petroleum, which would be LPG, which is a category of gases, not just propane, or carbon dioxide gas, must have proper detection and alarm systems as required by rule and the NFPA. By rule, they mean the marijuana rules and also the Bureau of Construction Code rules. If a marijuana facility utilizes these processes without proper detection and alarm systems, the facility will not be inspected by the Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs. They're telling you that if you don't have the system in place, the right alarm and detection system in place, they will not show up to do your inspection. Or if they show up and it's not there, they won't do the inspection. They'll leave without doing so. There is a lot of confusion as to what an appropriate alarm system is, though. That's one of the things we're going to focus on later. So they go into the thresholds in a little bit more detail. And down here, they have the actual signage that they want, where it says caution down near the bottom, carbon dioxide gas, ventilate the area before entering. So without the ventilation air that Neil was talking about, or some sort of a purge exhaust, how do you ventilate the area before entering? There should be proper detection and alarm in these spaces that would tell you if the space is safe to enter before entering. There will be visual and audible notification outside and inside each of these spaces. A high carbon dioxide gas concentration in this area can cause suffocation. And down below, oh, somebody had a question?
Yeah, can I just clarify something?
Yeah, please.
Get something clarified. It's a question. So
Yeah.
this is saying that if a marijuana facility utilizes these processes without proper detection and alarm, the facility will not be inspected. But let's just say they're using carbon dioxide gas, and they're using tanks that are not over 100 pounds. See, now there is a line drawn because in the IFC, it says that if it's over 100 pounds of carbon dioxide, then you need detection systems and ventilation. But really doesn't say nothing about if they're using under 100 pounds of liquid carbon dioxide.
Very valid question. I'm going to back up the truck a little bit. Remember when we showed you the beverage dispensing and the beer dispensing?
Yes.
Location? Okay. Hopefully we'll get to show you a video later of the Phoenix Fire Department near miss reenactment video. It's where somebody almost died, a worker almost died, and then two first responders almost died trying to help her out. And Phoenix had enough fortitude, foresight, and personal investment in the situation to produce this reenactment video to teach people. The thing is very popular around the inspection community. I use it all the time. What happens is Phoenix Fire Department got involved in the code development process, much like I'm currently involved in code development process. And our group has other members that are currently involved in codes development process. Very key that we are involved in these because, so Phoenix Fire Department proposed certain language as amendments to the 2015 series of I-codes. So henceforth in the 2015 building code, 2015 IFC fire code, there is a section in there, 5703, I think it is.
5307.
5307, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you, Neil.
You're the one that showed me that.
Yeah. That's the problem trying to go by memory here. I don't have that note in front of me. But yeah, so that's where this originally came from, was the 100 pounds. And so after discussion with numerous people, how the 100 pounds came to be, unfortunately, it was like many other code provisions came to be. There was no specific science behind it, unfortunately, sadly. It was an arbitrary number that was arrived at upon the beverage dispensing industry being involved in the discussions, saying we've done this with these 50-pound cylinders, for 50 years, never had any problems. So we have one cylinder in use and we have one that's either full or empty off to the side. And in the hazardous material world, we have to count empties as full. So it doesn't matter if it's full or empty, it's counted as full, right? So if I have 2 cylinders sitting in this back of this restaurant or in this basement of this restaurant or bar, I now am at that threshold. So if I'm 100 pounds or less, I'm exempt. Well, 100 pounds in a small space is deadly. I did a sample calculation on a 20-pound cylinder in your typical strip mall, small sub shop that dispenses soda. It is enough to cause permanent injury in the lower part of the breathing zone. I'm going to ask you who uses the lower part of the breathing zone in a retail space?
Kids.
Kids, right. Toddler on your arm, holding your hand, holding daddy or mommy's finger, walking in there. Infant in a stroller. Their breathing zone is way down there. Carbon dioxide is denser than air, 1.6. So unless we have some very turbulent air in this space, that will layer just like a swimming pool. There have been cases documented where deaths have occurred by CO2 beverage dispensing companies coming to fill systems that are in merely dumpster enclosures being overcome by the gas. This is an outside enclosure with no top. These gentlemen died. Okay, we're talking inside a building here. So anyway, I did the math on a 20-pound cylinder and it still creates a hazard. So unfortunately, this arbitrary number got into the code. So the advantage is when I'm on the hazard review side, when I'm performing a hazard review, I can call out a lot of other things that, typically an inspector would not call out or have difficulty calling out. Because if it's a hazard, in my role as a person performing a hazard review, if it's a hazard, I have a duty and obligation to call it out, no matter what the code says. I will differentiate to what the code language is. And then if I have something additional, like as in 102.9, what we already talked about, or the intent of the code not being met, I will call those out and I will reference those particular code sections. So, especially in the case of walk-in cooler, is just about like a lot of these marijuana grow facilities. Your particular application, Neil, you guys are introducing ventilation air into your space in your jurisdiction, but a lot of them have conceded not to require ventilation air introduced, unfortunately. And what happens is now you have an airtight box, and without ventilation air, you're not diluting any small leak. You're relying strictly on that gas detection system to do its job. I'll tell you what, the gas detection system better be properly installed and maintained as a life safety system to be able to perform the function of saving lives.
But Ken, that's where the problem lies. You'll go to this grow and they'll say, we ain't got a 100-pound tank. We got a 50-pound tank. And like you said, well, it doesn't happen in Detroit because we require ventilation, but outside of Detroit, the jurisdictions that don't require ventilation, now you got a 50-pound carbon dioxide tank leaking in a little grow room area. And would that be enough to kill you? And then you get this code section that wasn't properly written, drawing the line at 100 pounds. It all depends on how big the grow facility is. And that's what that should have reflected.
Yeah, and I have some, you can always go back to a 102.9 though, matters not provided for, okay? Make sense?
Yeah,
And
but
you
now
can
you
always
got to be
go-
a chemist. Now
you
you
can
got
always
to
go back to intent also. So I would cite both of those code sections.
And here's the situation. So when we cite, we see that. When we cite that 404 where you need to bring in a third party chemical analysis company for evaluation, right away they're going to jump and say, "What? You're going to make us go through these hoops and it's going to cost us all this money to go through these hoops and get this third party chemical company to do an evaluation?" You see how that is?
Oh, right. It gets political.
Yes.
But I mean, these guys, some of them try to pretend, they're operating on a shoestring. Granted, a few of them maybe, but after being involved with the majority of these guys, they have bags of cash that, because of the banking, they can't put this money in the bank. So at least at one point in time, they have money, they just don't want to spend it. They're used to operating on a shoestring because we got to remember where the industry came from. Before any of this was legal, the industry came from basements and garages and, trying to maintain a low profile. It's hard to change the mentality to come out to the open now and be open and above board and do the right thing. And they're not used to having to deal with any regulations. So this is a learning curve for them. And it's kind of up to us to help them along the way. So I guess you don't even have to kill somebody, just merely injure somebody. And just the paperwork alone and the threat of a lawsuit and a small settlement is going to negate any money they saved even over the entire life cycle of the facility. So, some people are willing to gamble with lives, but as a code official, we definitely are not. As a building owner, on occasion, or building designer, they may choose to try to roll those dice, but it's up to our job it's up to us to make sure that they're doing the right thing. And that's what the intent is there for. That's what 1029 is there for. That's what 414.13 is there for, to make sure none of this stuff gets through these gaps where there are still existing hazards, even though they may have met a particular portion of the code, or there's a loophole in the code, as we say, or they like to call it gray area. The code official has a duty to make those determinations.
Again, many cities now, you go to put an air conditioner in there, and one of them is being Sterling Heights. You go put in an air conditioner, and the fire marshal will come out, and I talked to you about this, and he'll make the people remove that air conditioner, and they're like, "Why?" He goes, "Because now you're providing conditioned air above and beyond what's required for the house, and a lot of these transformers are blowing up and fires are happening because they're bringing in more power for their grows in the basement than what their power at the house is." So the city of Sterling Heights has put out an ordinance now that you can't put any AC above and beyond the heat load calculated for the house.
Well,
So now
honestly,
they're making
they actually have the right in the codes, Neil. If they're doing what they're supposed to be doing in the under the mechanical code, in the energy code, the Michigan Energy Code, for all residential, they're supposed to do what we call a heat plan, or a heating and cooling plan. And on there, they're supposed to provide the calculations or subsequent documents, the calculations showing the heat loss for the place, the heat gain for the place, and the equipment that is installed is supposed to be as close as possible to what the actual numbers are on those calculations. Otherwise, they are in violation of the energy code.
Yeah.
And
But
we
the
have
cities
every
are-
right to write the violation. We actually have the duty to write the violation that you've installed too much air conditioning or too large of a furnace. You need to remove that and put the proper size in. And I don't hear of it happening very often, but it's supposed to happen.
But how many plan reviewers ask for the heat load calculation on a plan review? Not too many.
Not enough, I can
Not
tell you
enough.
that. Rochester Hills, when we were doing the residential, we weren't doing it as a plan review, Neil. We were doing it as the code more talked about just providing a heat plan. So us looking at the heat plan, we were not reviewing it and approving it as, hey, this meets every intent of the code, or we're in love with your design. We were looking at that to make sure that they really had accounted for all the elements, that the plan met the layout of the particular building, you know, that somebody wasn't using a plan from a completely different home, if that makes sense. I've seen that numerous times.
Yeah.
So we're just looking to make sure, hey, things are matching up, that they have done, you know, the basic calculations, and that the furnace meets the calculation, the result of that calculation, that the air conditioning meets the result of that calculation. That's what we're supposed to be doing on all residential. So that makes perfect sense. So if they're doing anything beyond that, it's no longer residential at that point, even though it may be originally built as a 1 and 2 family dwelling. If they're taking a whole house or a whole basement in a house and using it for this purpose, it is no longer a 1 and 2 family dwelling.
Yeah, that house.
I'm sure you'll get some people that will debate with you on that, but
That house
that?
is making $40,000 every 3 months in growing marijuana. That's 120 grand a year. 3, 4 times, 160 grand a year. Every
Just
3
in the
months
basement.
they harvest.
yeah.
40 grand a harvest. They're going crazy. Houses are burning down all over Sterling Heights because they're all growing in their basements now.
Yeah, there's other areas of the state that had a lot of fires and explosions from extractions, the butane honey oil extraction being one of them. There are some gaps in the code, the way the code's written, and you know how to deal with some of the unvented equipment. The fact that how they came up with the threshold of the 100-pound limit, 100 pounds and below being exempt. Although 20 pounds could be a hazard, it's relative to the size of the space. And I will show you in NFPA 1 if we have time, but just know that in NFPA 1, there's a performance-based calculation method to determine if there's enough CO2 to cause a problem or not. It's very simple. It's about a half a page, and it's in NFPA 1 2018 edition. And I know, Craig, you said you had a couple questions or comments you wanted to go through here.
Well, yeah, as I stated, storage has always been an issue for me, and I think you're right. It is relative to where the system is and how much volume is in there. But you know, I don't think you can just look at it like, well, I'm under 100 pounds. I don't need a system. Well, I don't agree with that. And again, I wanted to point out that I believe NFPA 55 holds a limit to 75-pound storage in a story below grade. That was pointed out to me by a fire captain in the city of Ann Arbor. So just, I want to check that out.
Okay. And so we would get there, even though the code prescribes 100 pounds and less as being exempt, in certain applications, as far as small spaces, small enclosed spaces, spaces with little or no ventilation, spaces with less than code required ventilation, such as walk-in coolers, basements, small spaces, even a container as small as 20 pounds can create a hazard. So I was referring to the 2018 edition. Let me see how bad I'll mess this up, but I'm going to try to minimize this screen and go to NFPA 1 really quick, chapter 38. See if I can get there. If not, bear with me. Again, you probably can't read this, but 63.9 of the NFPA 1, titled Insulated Liquid Carbon Dioxide Systems, tells you that they have to comply with Chapter 13 of NFPA 55. And that's what you were referring to, Craig, that particular fire marshal mentioned. The limitation on basement storage of CO2 was less than the 100 pounds. So it talks a lot in here about all the particular things: piping, signage, gas detection. Well, what's cool in here is, in gas detection, it actually defines the height of the sensor 12 inches off the floor, and in the area where the gas is most likely to accumulate or leaks most likely to occur. Two parts to that. So if you had a gas supply system upstairs and the place had a basement or a crawl space, would the crawl space be an appropriate place to put detection? Of course, because what we have is the gas is going to want to accumulate in the crawl space because it's denser than air. CO2 has a density the same as gasoline, the same as propane, as far as the vapors are concerned. The system shall be designed to detect and notify at a low alarm level and a high level alarm. A lot of these devices that are becoming installed do not have both levels. The threshold for the low level alarm shall not exceed 5,000 parts per million. And when it's detected at a low level alarm, the system shall activate a signal at a normally attended location within the building. The threshold for activation of the high level alarm shall not exceed a concentration of 30,000 parts per million. And when it is detected at the high level alarm, shall activate audible and visual alarm at an approved location. What is an approved location? Acceptable to the authority having jurisdiction. How is the authority having jurisdiction going to determine if it's an approved location? It's going to require some thought, and it should not be arbitrary. The gold standard, the typical industry standard for locating audible and visual would be, if in doubt, default to what a fire alarm system asks for its audible and visual locations. Typically in the gas detection world, it's inside and outside of each space where the hazard is likely to occur. Right here, I'm going to tell you, I'll give you the code section number of this performance design option, Craig. It's 63.9.10 or 10. And it allows them to not provide carbon dioxide detection in certain cases. And here's the calculation. So, and this goes along with my logic for many years, is that the logic behind the calculation on the refrigerant calcs in chapter 11 of the mechanical code is flawed significantly. The reason is they allow you to use the whole space, including above ceiling spaces, in the volume calculation of the space. Problem is, the gas is denser than air. Typically, refrigerants are very close to the density of the CO2. They're usually around 1.5 to 1.7 as far as comparison to the density of air. So they are at least 1.5 times heavier than air, average of 1.6. So what they're doing, instead of calculating the whole space, they're calculating the breathing zone. I'm going to go down, I'm going to skip down here to item number 2. Calculate the volume of room containing the CO2 containers or the area where the CO2 is likely to congregate in cubic feet as follows. So in the case of a cylinder that's up on a main floor, like in a McDonald's or in a grow facility or what have you, you're going to also have to figure this for the basement or crawl space or any underfloor space that somebody could be required to work in for service or anything of that nature. So they're going to a height limitation of 5 feet or the ceiling, whichever is less. So in a building with an 8-foot ceiling, they're only allowing you to take the first 5 feet of height to do the volume calculation on this. And the threshold for the calculation is its PEL or OEL level, permissible exposure limit for an 8-hour workday of 5,000 parts per million. So instead of taking, like say, the whole height of the room, you're only taking 5 foot of it. That make more sense? To be able to make a good judgment on if CO2 is a hazard or not in a particular space. So I've used this on numerous occasions. In a walk-in cooler is always going to fall into the threshold of requiring detection in this case. And so here's your logic to back yourself up as a code official and as a designer, no matter what way you're looking at it, is you need to have something to back you up, and there's code language here to do so. I'm going to move away back from this code and get back to my presentation screen. So this is titled Emission of Nitrogen Oxides, known as NOx. Now, NOx is a broad category of nitrogen oxides. There are several different types of NOx. There are at least 3 different types of NOx. When burning different types of fuels. So as we can see, oil at the top, as in diesel fuel or what have you. And let's just use these as relative terms. We don't need to understand the actual volume, but let's just compare the different fuels. So oil has a value of 3, where coal, 4.5, which we don't burn too much anymore, but look at propane. I got highlighted in red at 2.3. Natural gas of 1. So if you run one of those heaters, I don't know what happened there. If you run one of those heaters that we showed in the previous screen on natural gas, it's going to produce a value of 1 as far as its NOx emissions. You fuel it with propane, it's 2.3 times more volume of NOx. That's a huge difference. Now look at the gasoline, like as in an automobile or what have you, of 27. That's a huge difference. And that's why NOx detection in the parking garage areas and motor vehicle areas, including forklift operations and warehouses, is very important. And that's a properly burning piece of equipment, as we discussed before. That thing starts running like low on compression, dirty spark plug, dirty air filter, what have you, throws these ratios way out of whack. Your unvented heater, the burners get dirty, throws it way out of whack. These levels go sky high. And that's when people go to the emergency room. And I've seen it in numerous jurisdictions I've worked in where multiple people were taken to the emergency room and some with permanent injuries. I haven't been directly involved in, a situation where somebody had died, fortunately, but the first responders have unfortunately, numerous occasions of that. Number one important tool I mentioned before, but here it is in front of us, is the intent. So the key words here are safety, health, and general welfare. So if we're going to regulate general welfare, which general welfare is like, it shouldn't take you 3 hours to change an air filter because somebody put some piping in the way, or the HVAC contractor didn't provide adequate access to get the filter out without dismantling something else. So we're going to regulate stuff like that. For sure, we're going to regulate all of our hazards, which is what Craig was alluding to. There are hazards that are not specifically addressed in the codes. I'll get to that here in a second. We're going to regulate, I keep hitting the slide button. We're going to regulate things like light and ventilation. We're definitely going to regulate the last one, other hazards. What are other hazards, you may ask? It's pretty wide reaching, isn't it? It's going back to telling us what 102.9 is telling us. Matters not provided for had to be determined by the code official. Now this is a long code section, so it has another couple slides here to it. This is the language that I did not know was here for many years. I take very seriously now after working very closely with fire departments. And that's to provide a reasonable level of safety to firefighters and emergency responders during emergency operations. Now, the reason this is important is because if we watch that Phoenix Fire Department reenactment video, what happens is the first responders almost become casualties. And a casualty is not necessarily a death in the first responder world. A casualty is somebody that requires off-site medical treatment, obviously going to the hospital or what have you. They almost became casualties, just like the lady that did become a casualty that was laying on the floor at the top of the stairwell at the McDonald's operation, McDonald's restaurant installation. So, and it's even mentioned first responders, emergency responders different than firefighters. So it's mentioning both as distinctly separate entities that need to be provided for. Now, in the world of emergency alarm systems and gas detection, we do this by providing remote enunciation, just like the NFPA 72 fire code or fire alarm code requires. I know a lot of designers, engineers, inspectors are not used to providing remote enunciation for fire alarm control panels. It actually is a requirement in NFPA 72 to have remote enunciation as necessary. So if your fire alarm control panel's at the first responder entrance, that's fine. That's remote enunciation. If your fire alarm control panel is buried in the building somewhere in some closet or the riser room, and that's not where the first responders are showing up when they first show up to any kind of emergency at that site, we have a problem if we don't have enunciation out at that location, because they have no idea what's going on inside the building, and we should not expect them, for their safety, to enter that building without knowing what's going on inside, when merely is a very simple modification to a system to add a remote enunciation to display at the emergency response entrance to what's going on, gas-wise, vapor-wise, or fire alarm-wise. It'll tell what zone's in enunciation, or what zone is in alarm, what the first zone was that went into alarm, and what the concentration of the gas is, so on and so forth. So here we have the most important definition of all time, which is approved. We alluded to that earlier as acceptable to the building official. And not just the building official, some places the language says code official, or it'll even say fire code official. So approved is to the particular official that, you know, that's their area of responsibility. Being involved in the code development process, I'm aware when this word gets added to the code, is added to the code deliberately. The reason it's added is what happens is it's added to specific code sections because it's impossible to prescribe a recipe, or that's my word, recipe. In code terminology, we call it a prescription. Okay, it's impossible to prescribe prescriptive requirements for all situations. What that means is, I'll use an example. If I have conditions A, B, and C, means I have to implement technical requirements of number 1, 2, and 3. That's very prescriptive. A lot of the things are not called out, like we mentioned, Craig mentioned, and Neil was mentioning it earlier, that we have to use intent, we have to use 102.9, we have to use the word approved to make sure there are no gaps in these buildings and building systems. Problem is, this word requires personal judgment and also leaves the responsibility on the code official to determine what they will and will not accept. So we all struggle with that to a point, as to, boy, what do I accept? Now, my first 10 years as a code official, I really hate to say it, but a lot of times I probably accepted when I shouldn't have what was submitted to me. Because I didn't dig enough, I didn't ask enough questions, I didn't have the right resources, or didn't find the right resources, did not spend the time to make a phone call, or even be responsible enough to say, hey, I have to get back to you on this, I have to do some research. There's no shame in that. Very important as maturity as a code official to be able to say those things and do the follow-up, get back to people. I know a lot of people demand an answer immediately, but we don't always have one. They don't always have one either. Well, when I do get to that decision and I have an idea of what I think is necessary, I back up and I say, let's run my thought process through the intent test. I want to determine if my decision has met the intent of the code so that I have a sound basis for the interpretations and decisions that are made. To do that, I ask a series of questions. My first one is, what is the intended function of the item we're talking about? So is it a life safety function? Is it, you know, to evacuate people out of the building? Is it just to alert people there's a hazard coming? Maybe an alarm, what do you want to say, a low-level warning level? Or is there gas or vapor at a danger level? What must be, or is maybe a fan stopped working and we need to know about it because that fan is providing our method of protection? If we lose our method of protection, what happens? Does somebody die? Could somebody die? Does somebody get injured? Or do they just become uncomfortable? We need to ask these questions. So what must be in place in order for these intended functions to happen? So a lot of times it's like, I don't know where to go for these answers. But if you look around, ask your peers, call ICC, call NFPA, recommend being members of all these so you have these resources available. There's also other resources if you're in the sprinkler world or fire alarm world, belonging to some of your trade associations. They have experts always at the ready on the telephone. Underwriters Laboratories, as a matter of fact, has people we can call, people we can message, and people we can send emails to for quick answers and formal interpretations, whatever the case may be. So there are standards out there if we research that are available so that we can be non-arbitrary in our decisions and have backup, especially if we find ourselves having to answer questions to somebody higher up the food chain. So here's me, not really me, but a representation of me sitting at my desk for numerous times during my career. What am I willing to approve?